Where are you listening from? Midnight in a quiet bedroom, or 2 a.m. on a sleepless night? Somewhere between restless and ready to wander. Dim the lights, let the screen's glow fade, and settle into the shadows of a world lit only by fire. Welcome to Dozing Historian. Tonight we're slipping into the medieval past, roughly 500 to 1500 CE, where food wasn't just sustenance, it was survival, struggle, and sometimes a small, stubborn spark of joy. This isn't a glossy history of kings' feasts or cookbook fantasies. It's a slow, gritty journey into what filled the bowls of peasants, lords, and monks, and why it so often tasted like toil. Imagine a table of coarse bread, thin stew, and sour ale, where every bite carried the weight of the harvest, the church, and the ever-looming threat of hunger. This is your quiet corner of the internet, where we tell stories the way a medieval storyteller might have by a flickering hearth, with the smell of smoke and earth in the air. If you're drawn to tales of forgotten lives, of resilience carved from scarcity, this is your nighttime ritual. So, pull up a stool, let the modern world dissolve, and join us in a time when food was less a pleasure than a prayer, when every meal was a bargain with the land and the heavens. If you'd like to support more slow, mythic history for weary souls, a like or subscribe is a quiet nod of kinship, no pressure, just connection. Now, let's step into the medieval kitchen, where the fire is low, the pot is simmering, and the story of why food sucked is just beginning to unfold. Picture yourself waking in a medieval village. The year is 1250, and the dawn is a smear of grey through a narrow window of wattle and daub. The air smells of damp straw, wood smoke, and something sour yesterday's pottage, still clinging to the pot above a smouldering hearth. You stretch on a straw-filled pallet, your stomach already muttering, not with anticipation, but with resignation. This is not a world of menus or markets brimming with choice. This is the world of the peasant, where food is not a delight, but a necessity, where every bite is a reminder of the land's limits and the labor it demands. Welcome to the peasant's plate, a study in monotony, where the same coarse bread, watery stew, and thin ale shape day after day, season after season, life after life. Let's sit at this rough-hewn table, feel the grit of the bread between your teeth, and understand why food in medieval times so often sucked. The peasant's diet. For the vast majority of Europe's population between 500 and 1500 CE was a narrow thread woven from what the land could yield and what the lords allowed you to keep. If you were one of the millions tilling fields in England, France, or the German territories, your daily meal revolved around two staples, bread and pottage. These were not the artisanal loaves or hearty soups of today's imagination. They were survival in edible form, plain, repetitive, and often barely enough to quiet the hunger that gnawed like a winter wind. Bread was the backbone, but not the soft, white bread of modern tables. It was dark, dense, and coarse, made from rye, barley, or a mix called maslin. Because wheat was often too precious for common folk, the flour was stone ground, and not always well. Tiny flecks of grit from the millstone could sneak into the dough, wearing down teeth over years of chewing. You'd feel it as you bit down, a faint crunch that wasn't grain but stone. A reminder that even your food carried the earth's weight. This bread wasn't baked in your home, not always. Most villages had a communal oven owned by the lord or the church, and you'd pay a fee-grain, labor, or coin to use it. You'd knead your dough on a wooden board, mix it with water and a pinch of salt if you were lucky, and let it rise. With wild yeast or a scrap of old dough saved from the last batch. The result was heavy, a loaf that sat in your stomach like a stone, meant to fill you more than please you. A single loaf might be your family's mainstay for days, cut in two. Thick slices, shared among children with muddy hands and adults too tired to care about flavor. If the harvest was poor or the miller dishonest, you might find chaff, dirt, or even sawdust mixed in, stretching the grain to feed more mouths. You ate it anyway, because hunger was a stricter master than taste. Then there was pottage, the other pillar of the peasant's diet, a word that sounds comforting but was anything but. Imagine a small iron pot over a fire, filled with water, a handful of barley or oats, and whatever you could scavenge from the garden or the wild, turnips, cabbages, leeks, maybe a fistful of beans or peas. If you were fortunate, you'd toss in wild herbs, nettles, dandelion, or parsley to mask the blandness. This was pottage, a thin, greyish stew, boiled until it was a mush, served in wooden bowls or straight from the pot. You'd dip your bread into it, softening the crust, or sip it with a wooden spoon, the same one passed around the family. It wasn't rich or savoury. It was sustenance, a warm sludge that kept you moving through the cold mornings and long days. In the fields, day after day, the same pot bubbled, the same ingredients repeated, because variety was a luxury you didn't have. The monotony of this diet wasn't just a matter of taste, it was structural, rooted in the rhythms of the medieval world. Most peasants were tied to the land through the feudal system, working fields owned by lords or monasteries. You grew what the land allowed, and in much of Europe, that meant grains like rye, barley, or oats, which could survive the damp, cold climates of northern regions. Wheat was grown, but it often went to the lord's table or the market, not yours. Vegetables were limited to what you could grow in a small garden plot near your hut. Hardy crops, like cabbages, onions, or turnips, which could withstand frost or poor soil. Fruits were rare, often wild berries or apples foraged in season, and even then they were a treat, not a staple. Your diet was tethered to the seasons, and the seasons were not kind. Spring brought hunger as winter stores dwindled. Summer offered hope, but only if the harvest came. Winter was a long, lean wait, with pottage growing thinner as the months dragged on. Meat was a distant dream for most peasants. You might keep a pig, fed on scraps and acorns, slaughtered in autumn for a rare feast. But most of the meat went to the Lord as part of your tithe, leaving you with bones for broth or a scrap of fat for flavor. Chickens, if you had them, were for eggs. Not eating eggs were too valuable, and a hen was a living investment. Wild game like deer or boar was off limits, reserved for the Lord's hunt, and poaching could cost you a hand or your life. Fish was a possibility if you lived near a river or coast, but even then it was often smoked or salted, a chewy, pungent addition to your pottage rather than a meal on its own. The Church's fasting rules, which we'll explore later, further limited meat, banning it on Fridays, Lent, and other holy days up to a third of the year. So, your plate remained stubbornly vegetarian, not by choice, but by necessity. A repetitive cycle of grain and root, until the seasons turned again. Drink was no better. Water was often unsafe, drawn from wells or streams tainted by human and animal waste. Ale was the peasant's drink, brewed at home or by the village alewife, but it was weak, cloudy, and often sour. Made from barley or oats, it was more liquid bread than beer, low in alcohol but safer than water. You'd drink it morning to night, even giving it to children, because it was one of the few things you could trust not to make you sick. Wine was for the wealthy, a distant rumor from the vineyards of Bordeaux or Tuscany. If you were lucky, you might get a sip of mead or cider during a festival, but these were fleeting moments, not daily comforts. Your mug held ale, and it tasted of survival, not pleasure. Yet within this monotony, there were flickers of relief. Small moments where the peasant's plate held something more. Cheese, if you kept a cow or goat, was a treasure, hard and sharp, shaved into thin slices to stretch it further. Butter was rarer, often traded or sold rather than eaten. Herbs from the wild thyme sage or garlic could lift a pottage from dull to tolerable, though you had to know where to look and when to pick. Festivals, tied to the church calendar or harvest cycles, brought rare abundance. At Michaelmas or Christmas, you might share a communal pot of stew with a scrap of pork or mutton, seasoned with precious salt. These were the days when the village gathered, when the fire burned brighter, and the taste of something richer lingered on your tongue. But these were exceptions, not the rule. Most days, you ate what you had, and what you had was the same as yesterday. This repetitive diet wasn't just a culinary limitation. It was a physical and psychological weight. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries shows the toll of this food on peasant bodies. Skeletons from rural villages in England and Germany reveal worn teeth, ground down by gritty bread, and bones marked by periods of malnutrition, especially in children. Dental calculus hardened plaque preserves, traces of barley, oats, and occasional vegetables, but rarely meat or fruit. Isotope analysis of bones confirms a diet heavy in grains, low in protein, and lacking the diversity of earlier hunter-gatherer diets. You were lean, not from health, but from scarcity, strong from labor, but fragile from hunger. The monotony seeped into your bones, your teeth, your days, shaping a life where food was less about joy and more about endurance. But let's pause here, at this rough table, and consider the hands that set it. The peasant wasn't just a victim of this diet, they were its architect, coaxing life from stubborn soil. You knew your land, not as a map, but as a living thing when the frost would break, where the wild garlic grew, which field yielded best after rain. You weren't a botanist with a scroll, but you knew the rhythm of seeds, the smell of ripe barley, the way a turnip's leaves signaled it was ready. Your knowledge was practical, passed through generations, not in books but in calloused hands and quiet corrections. You taught your children to knead dough, to stir pottage without scorching, to save the best grain for planting. This was survival. Yes, but also a kind of intimacy, a conversation with the earth that modern tables have forgotten. The monotony of the peasant's plate was also a social glue. You didn't eat alone. Meals were shared, not just with family, but with neighbors, kin, or strangers seeking shelter. The hearth was the center, the pot a communal heart. You'd pass the bowl, break the bread, and tell stories, maybe of a good harvest, maybe of a saint's miracle, maybe of the wolf that stole a pig last winter. These moments, however plain, were where the village lived, where laughter or complaints rose over the clink of spoons. The food sucked, yes, but it was yours, and it bound you to the people who shared it. In a world where lords took your grain, and the church took your Sundays, the act of eating together was a small rebellion, a claim to something human. Compare this to the noble's table, which we'll visit later, where food was a display of power, not connection. For you, the peasant, food was a necessity, not a performance. Yet even in its simplicity, there was meaning. The bread you broke was a symbol, not just of hunger, but of survival, of the land you worked, of the hands that fed you. The pottage, however thin, was a reminder that you were still here, still breathing, still part of the village's rhythm. It wasn't delicious, but it was enough, and in a world where famine was never far, enough was a kind of miracle. The archaeological record backs this up. At sites like Warham Percy in England, excavators found traces of simple hearths in peasant homes, surrounded by fragments of pottery and charred grains. These were not kitchens of abundance, but of persistence. The pots were small, meant for small families or shared meals. The bones, mostly pig or chicken, were few, often cracked for marrow, a sign that every scrap was used. This was a world where waste was unthinkable, where food was too hard-won to discard. You ate what you had, and you made it last, because the alternative was a winter with an empty pot. This monotony, this relentless sameness, wasn't just a diet, it was a worldview. It taught you patience, endurance, gratitude for the smallest variation. A handful of wild plums in summer, a sip of mead at a wedding, these were explosions of flavor, moments that lingered in memory because they were so rare. Modern palates, spoiled by choice, can't grasp the weight of a single apple in a world of barley and mud. But you did. You knew the taste of scarcity, and you knew the fleeting joy of enough. So, as we sit here, by this smoky hearth, with a bowl of cooling pottage and a crust of gritty bread, let's not just taste the monotonous, feel it. Feel the weight of the spoon, the ache in your jaw, the faint warmth of the fire against your skin. This was the peasant's plate, a daily ritual of survival, a testament to a life lived close to the earth. It sucked, yes, but it was also the foundation of everything that followed: the feasts, the cities, the stories, and in its stubborn simplicity, it held a truth we've nearly forgotten, that food, even when it's plain, is a story of labor, land, and the people who share it. Now, let's step outside, into the fields, where the real work of feeding a village began. Step outside your hut, into the pale light of a medieval morning, somewhere around 1300 CE. The air is damp, heavy with the scent of turned earth and dew-soaked grass. Your hands, already calloused, grip a wooden hoe, its handle worn smooth by years of use. The field stretches before you, a patchwork of uneven rows, each furrow a silent demand for your sweat. This is not a garden of leisure, not a plot tended for joy. This is the medieval harvest, a relentless hustle that begins before dawn and ends when the light fails. A cycle of labor that ties your life to the land as surely as roots bind the soil. Food in the Middle Ages was not just eaten, it was earned. Carved from the earth with tools that bruised your palms and a rhythm that broke your back. Let's walk these fields, feel the weight of the plow, and understand why the act of feeding a village was a toil that shaped every bite in the medieval world. Food began in the dirt, and for the peasant 9 out of 10 people in Europe between 500 and 1500 CE, this meant a life defined by agricultural labor. You were not a farmer in the modern sense, with machines or markets to ease the burden. You were a serf, a villain, or a free tenant, bound to the land by feudal obligation. Your days were spent in fields owned by a lord, a monastery, or the church, where you worked to grow the grain that fed your family, your village, and those above you. The tools were simple, often ancient. A wooden plow pulled by oxen if you were lucky, or by your own strength if you weren't. A sickle for reaping, its curved blade dulling with every stalk. A flail for threshing, heavy enough to make your shoulders scream. These were not tools of precision, but of endurance, and they demanded your body as much as your skill. Ploughing was the first act of the harvest hustle, and it was brutal. Imagine pushing a wooden plough through clay-heavy soil, the blade catching on roots or stones, the oxen stubborn or the ground too wet. You'd lean into it, muscles straining, sweat mixing with the dust on your skin. The plough didn't slice cleanly like modern steel. It tore, it dragged, it demanded you wrestle the earth into submission. In Northern Europe, where soils were often heavy and rains frequent, this was a springtime ritual, preparing fields for barley, rye, or oats. You'd walk miles behind that plough, guiding it through furrows, knowing that a poorly turned field meant a thinner harvest, a hungrier winter. Women and children joined in, not as helpers but as equals in the labor, pulling weeds, breaking clods, scattering seeds by hand. Every member of the village was part of this chain, because food was not an individual project. It was a communal debt. Sowing came next, a task that required not just effort but knowledge. You'd learned from your parents, who learned from theirs. When to plant, after the last frost, when the soil warmed enough to wake the seeds. You'd scatter barley or rye from a sack slung over your shoulder, aiming for even rows, but the wind or an uneven hand could scatter your hopes. Seeds were precious, often saved from the last harvest, and every one that failed to sprout was a loss you'd feel in your stomach months later. You didn't have fertilizers or crop rotation. Science, those came later. You relied on instinct, prayer, and the faint memory of what worked last year. The land was not a partner. It was a taskmaster, giving only what you forced it to yield. The growing season was a tense wait, a gamble against forces you couldn't control. Rain was both friend and foe. Too little, and the crops withered. Too much, and they drowned. Late frost could kill young shoots. A summer hailstorm could flatten weeks of growth. You'd walk the fields, scanning for signs of blight or pests, knowing that a single bad season could mean starvation. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which we'll touch on later, was a stark reminder of this fragility, when endless rains turned fields to mud and left millions hungry. But even in a good year, the land demanded constant vigilance. You'd pull weeds by hand, shoo birds with slings or shouts, and pray the locusts stayed away. Children were sent into the fields with sticks to scare off crows, their small voices carrying across the rows. A reminder that survival was a family affair. Harvest was the climax of the hustle, and it was no less grueling. In late summer or early autumn, when the grain turned golden, you'd take up your sickle and bend to the task. Reaping meant hours of stooping, cutting stalks one by one, your back aching as the sun climbed. The sickle's blade, often iron but sometimes flint, dulled quickly, and sharpening it with a whetstone was another task in the endless chain. You'd gather the stalks into sheaves, tying them with straw, and stack them to dry, hoping rain wouldn't rot your work before it could be stored. Women and children followed behind, gleaning stray grains, because nothing could be wasted. The harvest was a race against time, weather, and exhaustion, and it wasn't yours alone. The Lord's share came first, often a third or more of your crop carted off to his granary before you could touch your own. Threshing and winnowing followed, tasks that turned grain into food but demanded yet more labor. You'd beat the sheaves with a flail to sticks bound by leather on a barn floor or open ground, separating grain from chaff. The rhythm was hypnotic but punishing, the dust choking your lungs, the flail bruising your hands. Winnowing meant tossing the grain into the air, letting the wind carry away the chaff, a task that required a good breeze and a steady hand. If you were lucky, you'd store the grain in a dry, rat-proof granary. But many villages lacked such luxuries, and you'd pile it in clay-lined pits or woven baskets, praying it wouldn't mold. Every step was a fight against loss, and every loss was a bite you wouldn't eat. Then there were the tithes and taxes, the feudal system's relentless cut. You owed the Lord a portion of your grain, your pigs, your eggs, sometimes in kind, sometimes in labor. The church took its tithe to 1/10 of your harvest, stored in tithe barns or sold to fund priests and monasteries. What remained was yours, but it was never enough to feel secure. You'd grind your grain at the Lord's mill, paying another fee, and bake your bread in his oven, paying yet again. The system was designed to keep you working, to keep you tethered to the land, to ensure that your labor fed those above you, before it fed your children. It wasn't slavery, but it was a chain, and it bound you to the fields as surely as the seasons did. The labor wasn't just physical, it was emotional. You lived with the constant weight of uncertainty. Would the harvest be enough? Would the Lord take too much? Would the winter stores last? Every seed you planted was a hope. Every sheaf you stacked a prayer. The archaeological record bears this out. Skeletons from medieval villages, like Warham Percy in England, show signs of repetitive stress-worn joints, curved spines, hands gnarled from years of gripping tools. These were bodies shaped by toil, not just for a season, but for a lifetime. Children as young as 7 worked alongside adults, their small bones already showing the strain of lifting, carrying, digging. Women, often pregnant or nursing, labored in the fields as much as men, their diets barely supporting the extra burden. The harvest hustle was a family affair, but it was also a family burden. Yet, within this grind, there was a kind of stubborn intimacy with the land. You knew your fields, not as property, but as a living thing. You could smell when the soil was ready for planting, feel the texture of ripe grain, hear the rustle of a field ready to reap. This knowledge wasn't written in books, it was carried in your hands, your eyes, your memory. You taught your children to spot the first green shoots, to know which weeds could be eaten, to feel the weight of a good sheaf. This was a science of survival, passed through generations, not in classrooms, but in the furrows. You weren't a scholar, but you were a steward, reading the land like a sacred text. Its seasons your scripture. The communal nature of the harvest was another anchor. You didn't work alone. The village moved as one, neighbors sharing oxen, children gleaning together, women singing as they bound sheaves. The labor was brutal, but it was shared, and in that sharing there was a rhythm, a pulse that held the village together at harvest's end. If the yield was good, there might be a feast, a rare moment of abundance, with ale flowing and a pig roasting over a fire. These were the days when the toil felt worth it, when the fields gave back, when the village laughed under an open sky. But even these moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the knowledge that next year's hustle was already waiting. The archaeological evidence paints a vivid picture. At sites like Ron's Fernals in England, excavators found traces of medieval fields furrows preserved in soil, worn tools scattered nearby, sickles and plowshares, often repaired until they broke, tell of a world where nothing was wasted. Grain pits, lined with clay or straw, show the care taken to store food, but also the losses charred grains from fires, rodent-gnawed remains. These were not fields of plenty, but of persistence. where every harvest was a victory against the odds. The harvest hustle wasn't just about food, it was about identity. You were the land you worked, the grain you grew, the bread you broke. The toil shaped your body, your days, your dreams. It was a life of repetition, not just in what you ate, but in what you did plow, sow, reap, thresh. Repeat. It sucked the strength from your bones, but it also gave you purpose. You fed your family, your village, your lord, and in doing so, you were part of something larger, a cycle that turned with the seasons, the stars, the church bells. The food on your table was hard-won, and every bite carried the taste of your labor, your land, your life. So, as we stand here in this field, the plow heavy in your hands, the sun burning your neck, let's feel the weight of the harvest hustle. Feel the ache in your arms, the dirt under your nails, the hope and fear in every seed. This was the medieval peasant's world, where food was not a gift but a fight, where every meal was a story of toil. It sucked, yes, but it was also a testament to resilience, to the human will to wrest life from the earth. Now, let's carry our sheaves back to the village, because the harvest was only the beginning, and hunger was waiting. Step into the dimness of a medieval granary. The year is 1316, and the air is thick with the musty scent of damp grain and creeping mold. The wooden walls creak under a cold wind, and your boots scuff against a floor littered with husks and rat droppings. You reach into a sack, hoping for a handful of dry barley, but your fingers find clumps, soft and sour, ruined by the endless rain that's drowned the world outside. Your stomach twists, not just with hunger but with dread, because the stores are dwindling and winter is only half over. This is the medieval peasant's reality, a life poised on the knife edge of scarcity, where food is never certain, where plenty can turn to famine with a single bad season. Welcome to the cruel cycle of feast or famine, where the land's whims ruled your plate, and hunger was a shadow that never fully lifted. Let's stand in this failing granary, feel the weight of an empty sack, and trace why food in the Middle Ages so often slipped through your fingers. For the medieval peasant, food was a fragile promise, dependent on forces beyond your control, whether pests, war, and the greed of those above you. Between 500 and 1500 CE, Europe's population lived mostly in villages, tied to the land through feudal bonds, growing grains like rye, barley, and oats to survive. But the land was not a gentle provider. It gave and it took, and when it took, it left you with nothing but desperation. The cycle of scarcity wasn't just a bad year here or there. It was a structural truth woven into the fabric of medieval life. Your granary, if you had one, was a lifeline, but it was also a gamble, vulnerable to rot, rodents, and the relentless damp of northern Europe's climate. Every harvest was a race to store enough, and every winter was a test of whether you'd stored well. Storage itself was a nightmare. You didn't have airtight silos or chemical preservatives. Grain was kept in clay-lined pits, woven baskets, or wooden bins, often in a corner of your hut or a shared village barn. These were makeshift, imperfect solutions. Rain could seep through a thatched roof, turning barley to mush. Mice and rats were constant thieves, their teeth leaving trails through your stores. Insects, weevils, moths burrowed into the grain, laying eggs that hatched into wriggling ruin. Mold was the worst enemy, thriving in the damp, turning whole. Sacks into a stinking, toxic waste. You'd sift through the grain, picking out what was salvageable, but sometimes there was nothing left but a faint hope and a prayer. Archaeological digs at sites like West Cotton in England reveal granaries with charred or spoiled grain. Proof of fires set to clear infestations or stores abandoned when rot won. These were not warehouses of abundance, but battlegrounds where you fought to keep what you'd grown. When the stores failed, famine followed, and it was a beast that devoured entire villages. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was a cataclysm, one of the worst in European history, and it shows the stakes of this cycle. For 3 years, relentless rain fell across northern Europe, turning fields into bogs and drowning crops before they could ripen. Rye and barley rotted in the ground. Oats mildewed before they could be cut. Harvests failed, not once, but year after year, and granaries emptied faster than they could be filled. Prices for grain skyrocketed. Records from England show wheat costing 8 times its normal price by 1316. Peasants ate their seed grain, the promise of next year's crop, because there was nothing else. Livestock starved or were slaughtered, leaving no milk, no eggs, no plough animals. By 1317, millions were dead. Estimates suggest 5 to 10% of Europe's population perished, with some regions losing far more. Chronicles from the time speak of bodies piled in streets, of parents abandoning children, of rumors too grim to repeat. Famine wasn't just starvation, it was a collapse of the world you knew. You'd walk past fields once golden, now choked with weeds, the soil too wet to plough. Your neighbors, once sharing bread, now guarded their scraps with hollow eyes. The church offered prayers, but the heavens answered with more rain. You'd turn to famine foods, the last resort of the desperate. Nettles, dandelions, and wild grasses went into the pot, their bitterness a mockery of pottage. Bark was stripped from trees, ground into a gritty flour that tore at your guts. Spoiled grain, green with mold, was eaten anyway, risking sickness or worse got. A fungal poison in rye could spark hallucinations, convulsions, or death. Mass graves from this period, like those found in London's Spitalfields, show skeletons with signs of malnutrition, brittle bones, stunted growth, teeth marked by years of hunger. These were not just bodies, but stories, each one a testament to the famine's reach. The cruelty of scarcity wasn't just natural, it was social. The feudal system deepened the cycle's bite. Lords and monasteries hoarded grain in their stone-walled barns, safe from the rats and rain that plagued your stores. When famine struck, they sold their surplus at prices you couldn't pay, or they fed their own households while you begged. Manorial records from England show lords dining on meat and wine during the Great Famine, while their tenants ate leaves. The church, too, took its tithe, the 10th of your harvest, even in lean years, storing it in tithe barns or selling it to distant markets. You'd watch carts roll away with your grain, knowing it wouldn't return to feed your children. This wasn't malice, not always. It was the system, a hierarchy where your hunger was less important than a lord's feast or a priest's offering. War made it worse. The Middle Ages were a time of near-constant conflict, from Viking raids to the 100 Years' War. Armies trampled fields, burned crops, and requisitioned grain to feed soldiers. In 1340s France, English chevauchés' raids meant to devastate left villagers starving, their harvests ashes. Peasants fled to walled towns, only to find no food there either. Bandits and deserters roamed, stealing what little you'd hidden. Even peace brought no relief, as lords demanded extra labor or taxes to rebuild their castles or fund their wars. Your fields, your labor, your food, they were never fully yours. Scarcity didn't just empty your stomach, it reshaped your soul. You lived with a constant, low hum of fear, a knowledge that the next bad season could be your last. Spring was the hungriest time, when winter stores were gone and the new crops weren't yet ripe. You'd ration your pottage, thinning it with water until it was barely more than broth. Children cried for more, and you'd give them your share, feeling the ache in your own bones. You'd pray at church, not just for rain or sun, but for mercy, for a miracle to fill the granary. Saints' lives from the period tell of miracles, loaves multiplying, wells turning to milk, but your miracles were smaller, a hidden sack of oats, a neighbor's gift of a turnip, a day without rain. Yet, in this cycle of scarcity, there were moments of defiance, flickers of resilience that kept you alive. You learned to stretch what you had. A single pig's bones could flavor pottage for weeks, boiled until they crumbled. Herbs from the wild sorrel time added life to a bland stew. You bartered with neighbors, a handful of beans for a scrap of cheese, because no one survived alone. Women, often the keepers of the hearth, were alchemists of scarcity, turning scraps into meals, saving seeds for planting, knowing which weeds could be eaten. Archaeological finds from medieval villages, like those at Warren Percy, show tools for foraging, small knives, baskets, proof of a knowledge that went beyond the fields. You weren't just a victim of famine, you were a fighter, clawing survival from the margins. Communal bonds were your shield. Villagers shared the burden of scarcity, not out of charity but necessity. If a neighbor's granary ran dry, you'd offer a scoop of your own, knowing they'd repay the debt when their turn came. Harvests were collective efforts, and so was hunger. During famines, some villagers pooled their stores, doling out rations to keep everyone alive. Church ales, communal feasts, funded by brewing, brought moments of relief, where ale and laughter drowned the fear for a night. These weren't feasts of plenty, but of persistence, a reminder that you were still here, still together. The cycle of feast or famine wasn't just about food, it was about power. The lords who ate while you starved held your life in their hands, not just through land but through grain. When they opened their barns in famine years, it was a calculated act, binding you with gratitude or debt. The church, too, wielded food as control, promising salvation for fasting but demanding tithes. That left you hungry. Scarcity widened the gap between you and them, turning every meal into a reminder of your place. Yet, it also sharpened your ingenuity. You hid grain from the tithe collector, buried it in secret pits. You poached fish from the Lord's river, risking a whipping for a taste of trout. These were small rebellions, but they were yours. The archaeological record tells the story in fragments. At sites like Ron's Fernals, grain pits show signs of careful lining, an attempt to keep moisture at bay. Charred remains suggest fires set to save what mold threatened. Animal bones, cracked for marrow, speak of a hunger that left nothing to waste. Human remains from famine years, thinner bones, shorter statures carry the scars of scarcity, but they also carry traces of survival, healed fractures, worn teeth, lives that endured. You were not just a statistic in a chronicle. You were a person, fighting the cycle with every breath. This cruel cycle shaped more than your diet shaped. Your world, it taught you to live with less, to savor the rare moments of plenty, to see food as a gift and a burden. A good harvest was a feast, not of lavish dishes, but of relief, of a granary full enough to quiet the fear. A bad harvest was a famine, not just of food, but of hope, a reminder that the land could betray you. Yet, you kept planting, kept harvesting, kept living, because the cycle turned, and you turned with it. So, as we stand in this granary, the sacks half empty, the rain drumming outside, let's feel the weight of scarcity. Feel the damp grain in your hands, the knot of hunger in your gut, the faint hope that tomorrow might bring sun. This was the medieval peasant's world, where food was a gamble, where famine was a neighbor who came too often. It sucked, yes, but it also forged a resilience we've nearly forgotten, a will to survive that carried you through the cruelest cycles. Now, let's step into the Lord's hall, where the table groans with plenty, but danger hides in every bite. Step through the heavy oak doors of a Lord's hall. The year is 1375, and the air shifts from the damp chill of the village to a haze of warmth and spice. Torches flicker along stone walls, casting shadows over tapestries of hunts and battles. The long table groans under platters of roasted swan, venison dripping with sauce, and goblets of ruby red wine from distant Gascony. Servants bustle, their hands steady but eyes lowered, as minstrels pluck lutes in the corner, their notes mingling with the clink of silver and the low hum of laughter. You're not a peasant here, scraping by on pottage. You're a guest at the noble's table, where food is a spectacle, a symbol of power, a parade of excess. But beneath the opulence lies a hidden truth. Even this lavish feast is fraught with danger, from spoiled meat to the slow poison of gluttony. Welcome to the medieval elite's dining hall, where abundance masks insecurity, and every bite comes with a risk. Let's sit among the velvet and gold, taste the saffron-laced sauce, and uncover why even the noble's food often sucked in the Middle Ages. From 500 to 1500 CE, the noble's table was a world apart from the peasant's hearth, a stage where wealth and status were displayed in every dish. If you were a lord, knight, or bishop in England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, your meals were not just sustenance, they were politics, a way to flaunt your power, secure alliances, and dazzle your rivals. A feast could last hours, with dozens of courses, each more extravagant than the last. Imagine platters of peacock, its iridescent feathers reattached for show, or a whole boar, its tusks gilded, carried in by sweating pages. Sauces thick with cinnamon and cloves, fruits preserved in honey, and pastries shaped like castles filled the table, each dish a testament to your wealth. This was not dining. It was theatre, and you, the noble, were the star. The centerpiece of these feasts was meat, a luxury the peasant rarely tasted. You'd carve into venison from your private forest, swan from your moat, or hare from your hunts, each bite a reminder of your dominion over the land. Game was prized, not just for flavor, but for status only. Nobles could hunt deer or boar, and poaching was a crime punished by mutilation or death. Domestic animals like beef, pork, or lamb were common too, but they were often fattened for the table, not slaughtered out of necessity. A single feast might include multiple meats, roasted, boiled, or baked into pies, each served with a sauce of wine, vinegar, or exotic spices. The form of curry, a 14th century English cookbook, lists dishes like blank manga, a creamy mix of chicken, rice, and almonds, or momini, a stew of meat and spiced wine, showing the complexity of noble cuisine. You'd eat with a knife and your fingers, sopping up sauces with bread. The act of eating as much a performance as the food itself. Spices were the crown jewels of the noble's table, worth more than the meat they flavored. Saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper came from distant lands, India, Indonesia, the Middle East, carried by merchants along treacherous trade routes. A pound of saffron could cost as much as a horse. A handful of pepper could ransom a night. These weren't just seasonings. They were currency, hoarded in locked chests, gifted to kings, or used to pay debts. You'd sprinkle them liberally, not for taste alone, but to show you could. A dish glowing yellow with saffron or black with pepper was a declaration. I am rich. I am connected. I am above you. The Leviandia, a French cookbook from the 14th century, calls for spices in nearly every recipe, from soups to sweets, a habit that baffled even contemporary travelers from spice-growing regions who noted Europe's obsession with costly flavored. Wine was another mark of status, flowing freely where peasants sipped weak ale. You'd drink from silver goblets, the wine imported from Bordeaux, Tuscany, or the Rhine, its tartness cutting through the richness of meat. Mead, made from fermented honey or hippocras, a spiced wine, might appear at grander feasts, each sip a reminder of your access to distant vineyards and trade networks. Ale was served too, but it was finer than the peasant's cloudy brew, filtered and flavored with herbs. You'd toast your guests, your king, or the saints, the act of drinking binding you to your allies as much as the food bound you to the land. But even the wine could turn vinegar sharp if poorly stored, a subtle risk in every cup. Yet, for all its splendor, the noble's table was a minefield of dangers, starting with the food itself. Preservation was as much a problem for you as for the peasant, despite your wealth. Without refrigeration, meat was salted, smoked, or dried, but these methods were imperfect. A roast might look grand, but beneath the spices, it could be rancid, its off-taste masked by cloves or ginger. Fish, often transported from coastal ports, arrived half-spoiled, its flesh soft and rank. The Taquinum Sanitatis, a medieval health guide, warned of corrupt foods causing illness, yet you ate them anyway, because waste was unthinkable. And a feast's success depended on abundance, not perfection. Servants might skim mold from saucers or carve away green patches from meat, but the risk remained. Food poisoning was common, though rarely recorded chronicles mention nobles falling ill after banquets, their symptoms blamed on poison or divine judgment. But often it was just bad fish. Overindulgence was another peril, a slow poison built into the noble's diet. You'd eat until your stomach ached, not just for pleasure, but for prestige. A feast with fewer than 10 courses was a failure. A guest who left hungry was an insult. This excess took a toll. Gout, caused by rich foods like meat and wine, was so common among nobles it was called the disease of kings. Medical texts, like the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitonum, warned against heavy meals. But you ignored them, because restraint was for peasants. Skeletal remains of medieval elites, like those from Canterbury's monastic cemeteries, show signs of obesity, worn joints, and dental decay from sugar-heavy desserts. Sweets, like marchpane or candied fruit, were noble treats, unknown to the village. Your teeth, blackened by honey and wine, were a badge of wealth, but they ached with every bite. The noble's diet was also unbalanced, skewed toward prestige over health. You ate meat in quantities that dwarfed the peasant's grain-heavy meals, but vegetables were scorned as peasant food. Salads of herbs or roots appeared, but they were sides, not stars. Fruits were prized, often imported figs, dates, or pomegranates, but they were seasonal or preserved, their freshness a gamble. The lack of fiber and vitamins left you vulnerable to scurvy or digestive woes, though medieval medicine blamed humors rather than diet. You'd consult physicians who prescribed purges or bleeding, but these did little to counter the damage of a table groaning with excess. The peasant's monotony was unhealthy, but your indulgence was its own kind of poison. Social pressures added another layer of danger. A feast was a contract, a display of loyalty and power, but it was also a battlefield. You'd watch your guests, noting who ate heartily and who picked at their plate. Disdain for your food was a subtle slight. Poison was a real fear. Chronicles, like Froissart's, describe nobles dying suspiciously after meals, though proof is scarce. You'd employ tasters, servants who sampled each dish, but their presence was as much theatre as protection, a show of your importance. The cost of these feasts was another risk. A single banquet could drain your coffers, forcing you to tax your peasants harder or borrow from merchants. The 1381 peasants' revolt in England was fueled partly by such burdens as lords squeezed villagers to fund their tables. Your feast might impress, but it could spark rebellion. Even the act of eating was fraught. You'd share trenches, wooden or bread plates with your neighbor, a gesture of camaraderie but also a hygiene nightmare. Hands dipped into communal dishes, unwashed after handling knives or dogs under the table. The Decinum Sanitatis urged washing hands, but it was a formality, not a habit. Rush-strewn floors harbored fleas, rats, and scraps, a breeding ground for disease. Dysentery and typhoid, linked to contaminated food, didn't spare the elite nobles, died as often as peasants, though their deaths were better recorded. Your wealth bought you spices and swans, but it couldn't buy clean water or safe meat. Yet, amidst the risks, the noble's table was a place of fleeting joy, a rare moment where the medieval world felt alive with possibility. You'd laugh with your guests, swapping tales of battles or hunts, the firelight glinting off your rings. A troubadour might sing of love, their voice curling through the hall like incense. The taste of cinnamon or a sip of Malmsey wine could transport you, however briefly, to a world beyond your castle's walls. These feasts were not just meals but rituals, binding you to your vassals, your kin, your god. You'd give alms to the poor afterward, tossing scraps or coins, a nod to charity that doubled as a flex of power. The table was where you were most yourself, lord, patron, warrior, sinner. Archaeological evidence paints this scene vividly. At castles like Bodiam in England, excavators found bones of deer, swan, and peacock, proof of noble menus, ceramic jugs, some still stained with wine, and fragments of imported glassware show the wealth poured into dining. Spices like peppercorns, rare in peasant sites, appear in elite middens, alongside oyster shells and fish bones from distant seas. Human remains tell a darker tale. Skeletons from noble burials, like those at York Minster, show gout, obesity, and dental caries, scars of a rich diet. These were people who ate to impress, but their bodies paid the price. The noble's table was a paradox, a place of splendor and peril, where food was both a weapon and a weakness. It separated you from the peasant, but it didn't spare you from the medieval world's harsh truths, spoilage, disease, and the fragility of power. The peasant's pottage was monotonous, but it was honest. Your feast was dazzling, but it lied, hiding rot beneath saffron and hunger beneath excess. It sucked, not because it lacked flavor, but because it came with a cost to your health, your wealth, your soul. So, As we sit here, a goblet in hand, the table heavy with gilded dishes, let's taste the bitter edge of this opulence. Feel the weight of the silver, the heat of the spices, the faint unease of a sauce too rich, too old. This was the noble's world, where food was a crown and a curse, where every feast was a gamble with fate. It sucked, yes, but it was also a stage, a fleeting moment of glory in a world where even the mighty were mortal. Now, let's leave the hall, step back into the village, and face the pungent reality of how food was kept or lost in the fight. To survive, the fire in the medieval hearth has burned low, its embers casting a faint glow over a world where every meal was a battle, a prayer, a fleeting taste of survival. From the peasant's gritty bread to the noble's spiced swan, food in the Middle Ages was a paradox. It sustained life, but carried the weight of toil, scarcity, and danger. Yet, in its simplicity or excess, it wove people together round a village pot, a lord's table, a festival's shared loaf. These meals, however meager or flawed, fueled a world that birthed cathedrals, sagas, and the seeds of our own abundance. We've lost their closeness, the way a single apple could spark joy, the way a story over pottage could bind a village. But their resilience lives in us, in every bite we take, without fear of an empty granary. So, tonight, as you drift toward sleep, share a simple meal, a bowl of soup, a crust of bread, and tell a story out loud. Let it carry the echo of those medieval fires, where food, even when it sucked, was a testament to human endurance. If this slow mythic journey stirred you, leave a like or subscribe, a quiet nod to keep these tales alive. No pressure, just connection. Wherever you are, midnight, in a city, or 2 a.m. in a quiet room, thank you for sitting with us, for tasting the past. The night is deep now, the stars bright above your own hearth. Dream of fields and feasts, of hands that worked and shared. Good night, wanderer. May your sleep be gentle, your table full, and your stories never silent.